Go ahead and turn to 20th chapter of the book of Acts. Acts chapter 20. We'll be getting started there in just a moment. Acts chapter 20. If you're following either workbook, it would be lesson number 19. Lesson 19, chapter 20. Before we get into the lesson itself, we just want to quickly remind ourselves of the outline of the book that we've been following. The two-part outline where we have these two sections, the Gospel in Palestine in 1 through 12, and the Gospel in the uttermost parts of the world in 13 through 28. 1 through 12, we haven't reminded ourselves of this in some time, but we subdivided that down into two subsections. 1 through 7 was the gospel in Jerusalem. And then in chapter 8, at the end of chapter 7 was the stoning of Stephen, and starting in chapter 8, the disciples were scattered. And they went about teaching, and so the gospel spread through Judea and Samaria. Then in chapter 13 beginning, we have the first of the three preaching or missionary journeys of the Apostle Paul recorded for us in 13 and 14. As we noted when we were in 15, we sort of take a parenthetical for a second to deal with the church issue in chapter 15. And then at the end of 15 and into 16, we have a second journey that goes to chapter 18. The end of 18 briefly mentions the start of that journey, but 19 and 20 really talk about the bulk of it, where Paul comes down later to Jerusalem. And then we also have Paul doing some teaching and preaching on his way to Rome from the Roman prison. And so those three preaching journeys, as well as the journey to prison, all take place in this latter half of the book of Acts. Last week, we talked about chapter 19 on last Wednesday and again on Sunday. And noted how in chapter 19, Paul had been in the city of Ephesus. And in his time in Ephesus, back in chapter 19, we had the early work that he did there, where you had those that came that knew only the baptism of John that he had taught, and then they were baptized. We had some opposition faced to him by the Jews, which is why they leave and go to the hall of Tyrannus in chapter 9. And they worked there daily for 2 years. And all the residents that were in Asia heard the word of the Lord, both Jews and Greeks, by the efforts that were done there. Then we had the so-called exorcists exposed, beginning in verse 11, where you had the 7 sons of Sceva, who tried to cast out spirits after seeing Paul doing it and seeing how just a handkerchief or an apron that touched his skin and was carried to the sick would heal them of their diseases and cast out the evil spirits. They tried to cast out evil spirits, saying, "I adjure you by the Jesus who Paul proclaims." So they tried to cast out the spirit that way, and obviously were unsuccessful. The man who had this evil spirit overtook them and mastered all 7 of them, and they left the house naked and wounded. And so word of this spread, and because of this, it showed the truth, the fact that Paul was teaching the truth that God was with him versus these so-called exorcists, Jewish exorcists before. And so the word of the Lord continued to increase and prevail mightily, verse 20. 21 and 22 talk about some of Paul's future plans. After we leave Asia, we want to go to Macedonia, Achaia, then to Jerusalem, and then hope to journey to Rome. He eventually does make it to Rome, but as we've noted before, not on his own terms. He makes it there going because of being put into prison. And so then in verse 23, going through the end, we have this riot that takes place in the city of Ephesus, where you have the silversmiths that are complaining because they've come to understand now that as people are starting to worship God, they're not going to be coming to worship Artemis or Diana, depending on your translation, and so their livelihood is put in jeopardy. And so they stir up the crowd, cause a great riot, where people were confused. Half the people shouted one thing, the other half shouted another. Some of them didn't know why they were there, they just saw a riot. I guess they thought it was fun to join in, so they joined in on the riot. But they come and eventually they are dismissed. at the end of the chapter, and after they are talked to by the town clerk, who quieted them and pointed out that the fact that the temple is here is undeniable. The fact that it has done them some good for people coming to see the temple and stuff is undeniable. They have no legitimate reason for this uproar that they're causing. If they do have a legitimate charge, go to the courts and don't do it in this assembly. And if there's anything else, use it for the regular assembly, or in reality what he's pointing out is use it for the assembly we're authorized to have, because the assembly they were having with these people rioting was not authorized under the Roman authority, as it was just a full-on riot, and so the people then dismissed. Chapter 20 verse 1 picks up where that leaves off. So first we have Paul here at Ephesus. He's going to travel on here through Asia, and you're going to hear about some of these other cities as he comes on down through here throughout the rest of this journey. But again, this is where we're going off from Ephesus, and this is how he journeys out on this this red line, and then this black line is the journey back through as he goes to places like Miletus. So let me get that. There we go, off the screen. Chapter 20 itself divides out into 4 sections. We have Paul's second visit to Macedonia and Greece. We're going to have the Lord's Day meeting at Troas, and then we're going to have Paul talking to the Ephesian elders at Miletus. A couple of sections we really want to focus on, second and fourth, where we really want to spend more of our time. So let's quickly start going here in section 1. We'll hit section 1. We'll spend again more time when we get to section 2 in just a moment. But section 1 is Paul's second visit to Macedonia and Greece. Let's read 1 through 6. It says, after the uproar ceased, Paul sent for the disciples, and after encouraging them, he said farewell and departed for Macedonia. When he had gone through the regions and had given them much encouragement, he came to Greece. There he spent 3 months, and when a plot was made against him by the Jews, as he was about to set sail for Syria, he decided to return through Macedonia. Sopater the Berean, the son of Pyrrhus, accompanied him, and of the Thessalonians, Aristarchus, and Secundus, and Gaius and Derbe, and Timothy, and the Asians, Tychicus, and Trophimus. These went on ahead and were waiting for us at Troas. But we sailed away from Philippi after the days of unleavened bread, and in 5 days we came to them at Troas, where we stayed for 7 days. Here we have the latter half of the journey. So in verse 1, the uproar has ceased, so Paul decides to, after he encourages the brethren there in the area of Asia, and those at Ephesus, after this uproar, he's going to encourage them and then leave. He spent quite a bit of time here with them. I'll mention that later on. We see that in the previous chapter, they were doing the daily work in the Hall of Tyrants for 2 years, plus he had already been reasoning for some time in the synagogues there as well. But Paul goes and he encourages the brethren before he departs. Something we find Paul doing a lot of times. Before he leaves the city, go back to Philippi and how he's charged to leave the city. And before he leaves Philippi, he goes and he encourages or strengthens the brethren. And something Paul did a lot before he left. And something Paul did in revisiting these cities. He would come back and revisit these cities to encourage them again. Something being done in Ephesus, where he had been here at the second journey. He was leaving to meet the feast in Jerusalem, told him he couldn't stay, but if God was, he'd come back. He did come back, and he spent a great deal of time there strengthening the brethren. So he leaves from there, he departs for Macedonia, and from there he spends 3 months in Greece. In verse 2, he came to Greece, he spent 3 months there, but then a plot was found against him by the Jews as he was about to leave, so he decided to return through Macedonia. So he comes through Macedonia on his way from Asia, comes down to Greece, he's there for 3 months, that's when the plot's found against him. He leaves from Greece, and as he goes back towards, is headed back, he goes back through the area of Macedonia on his journey back. So he's going from Asia through Macedonia to Greece, from Greece back through Macedonia on this journey. That's why if you look at the map, I won't take it back to the map. If you look on your workbook on the map, you'll notice you've got the lighter line, and it comes on down, and then you get to Corinth, and then you just loop back on around, and you come back through the same, back over to Macedonia through Berea, Thessalonica, Philippi, Troas, on down these areas that we're fixing to read of him going through. So he comes around, and he sort of makes a U-turn and comes right back through some of those same areas of Macedonia. Verse 4 is a list of people that are with him here. He sends those on ahead in verse 5 to wait for him at Troas. But he set sail from Philippi, and after the days of unleavened bread, he came to Troas, where he stayed for 7 days. A couple of things to note. Question 1. Just as a quick side note, and you can see this here in some of the other parts. Paul, as we talk the journeys of Paul, there are several epistles we know that Paul writes. Paul wrote either just under or just over half of the New Testament. There's an odd number of books. It depends on if you're Hebrews. If you ask me, I think he probably did. Follows his style. Whether he wrote it or not, he either wrote wrote just under half or just over half, depending on that book. Paul did a great deal of writing. We are familiar with what we refer to as the prison epistles. He wrote Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon while in prison the first time that we see here when the book of Acts ends. 2 Timothy is written during his second imprisonment. But some of the other books are written earlier in the time frame. So question 1, what books are being written during this section here at the early part of this chapter of the third journey?
1st and 2nd Corinthians.
He is writing 1st and 2nd Corinthians, and then Romans. Just an interesting side note, and Lord willing, when we get to the book of Romans, we'll make this point, or probably revisit this point. But when Paul wrote the book of Romans, do you know where he was at the time? What city he was in? He was in Corinth. So if Paul writes Romans, and I just find it interesting, if Paul writes Romans 1 in this list of these sins, he probably could have looked out his window and seen every one of them taking place in the streets of Corinth. That's where he wrote the first one from in his time there, as he went back through Corinth here on this third journey. But his 1st and 2nd Corinthians, the two books written to the church of Corinth, and then the book of Romans are written during this time frame. We'll come down to verse 7 through 12, the second part here, or actually real quick. What role did Paul's traveling companions play in the travels? Question 2.
Carrying letters and reports back and forth and protecting, assisting with preaching and teaching.
Do what?
That means they're like messengers?
Yes, they would be like messengers carrying those back and forth, reporting those. So, just as a side note, on that note of them carrying back and forth, if you go to, real quick, as we think about Paul's travel companions, one of them he writes a book to, not Timothy. One of them he writes a book to later on, which is another young preacher by the name of Titus. If you read 2 Corinthians, Paul says he's eager, waiting for Titus' report as to how they received the first letter. So Titus was sent with the first letter to the church of Corinth. He then is there, reads it to him, waits, and then goes back and reports to Paul what's being said. So that's the work that a lot of these are doing. They're taking the letters to these places as they're being written, and they'll come back and give some reports. So in chapter 7 of 2 Corinthians, as Paul talks about them being grieved, in Luke chapter 7, he points out about how Titus came and gave the report, and he was found glad by the report that was given to him by Titus. Let me double check here. When you know 2 Corinthians 7, it was one of the chapters. I didn't have the outline written in that Bible before. I believe it's chapter 7, where he's talking about the reason for the good. He's glad with the reports that he's received, and one of those has to do with the fact that Titus came and gave a good report. It's chapter 7. I have it outlined this way. Chapter 7 is about really two main comforts. The comfort and report of Titus. Titus came and gave a good report. They were receptive of the letter. And the comfort in the fact that the letter brought them to repentance. That's starting in verse 2 is that first section, going through verse 7 and then 8 to the end of the chapter. That chapter is unique because verse 1 of chapter 7 actually goes to chapter 6. So that's just an example there in 2 Corinthians 7, 2 through 7. Titus took the letter, gave a report, brought it back. So that's part of the role that these travel companions of the Apostle Paul played in his work, carry these letters to these places. Verse 7 now, the Lord's Day meeting at Troas. We'll begin in verse 7 to verse 12, and then we'll come back and discuss it. On the first day of the week, we were gathered together to break bread. Paul talked with them and intended to depart on the next day to prolong his speech until midnight. There were many lamps in the upper room where we were gathered, and a young man named Eutychus, sitting at the window, sank into a deep sleep as Paul talked still longer. And being overcome by sleep, he fell down from the third story and was taken up dead. But Paul went down and bent over him, and taking him in his arms, said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. And they took the youth away alive, and were not a little comforted. So as we come here into this section in 7 through 12, verse 7 is one we want to focus on for a moment. Verse 7, they come together on the first day of the week to break bread. If you look at your workbooks, under the heading, Lord's Day meeting at Troas, there's some things we want to talk about in that section there that are important things we need to know about this. When it comes to, we'll look at the first four first, and then we'll come to number 5 later on, about the importance of when we observe the Lord's Supper. So, number 1, as we talk about the Lord's Supper and the first day of the week, let's understand the significance of the first day of the week. There was significance in the first day of the week. It wasn't just an arbitrary, here's the day. There's some significance. Here's some things that happened on the first day. Jesus was raised from the dead on the first day of the week. Matthew 28:1, Mark 16, and verse 9. It was on the first day that Jesus arose from the dead. Number 2, Jesus appeared to his disciples on that same day, the first day of the week, John 20:29 and 26. Number 3, the first gospel sermon was preached on the first day of the week. Remember Acts 2, Pentecost is 50 days from the end of the Passover week. So the Passover week ends on Saturday, right? The 7th day of the week. It's 50 days. You do a little quick math. 7 times 7 is 49. Add one more day, we're on Sunday. So Pentecost fell on Sunday. And so the first sermon was preached on the first day of the week. Being that when the first sermon was preached, and Peter said that that day was the fulfillment of these Old Testament prophecies, that's also the day in which the church was established. And the Lord added to the church, Acts 2 and in verse 47, daily those being saved. So sometime between the beginning of that chapter and the end of that chapter, the point is made the church was established, it was on the day of Pentecost. So that's one of the significant things that take place on the first day of the week. The second thing that we need to understand about this is that this breaking of bread, this phrase breaking of bread, it can have a couple of different meanings in Scripture. For example, I want you to go into Acts chapter 2 for just a moment. Go to the end of Acts chapter 2. We'll see a couple of different uses here of the phrase breaking bread. In verse 42, somebody read Acts 2:42 for us.
They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, the fellowship, the breaking of bread, and prayer.
Okay, so verse 42, they devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching, fellowship, breaking of bread, and prayer. We'll talk about that in a second. Verse 46, will somebody read verse 46 for us now?
So continuing daily with one accord in the temple, breaking the bread from house to house, they gave their food to gladness and close to the word.
So twice in this chapter we have the phrase breaking bread. But both times it is referring to something different. Acts 2 and verse 42, they were breaking bread. I think has reference to the Lord's Supper. Consider the context. They devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching. So they were listening to what was being taught, and to the fellowship, and to the breaking of bread and prayers. So when you consider the context, that's how we know which breaking of bread is being talked about. Verse 42 is in the context of spiritual things. So the breaking of bread, verse 42 is the Lord's Supper. But in verse 46, they were day by day attending the temple together and breaking bread in their homes, and they received their food with gladness and generous hearts. What's verse 46 talking about? Common meal they're sharing together in each other's homes. So the phrase can refer to both. In fact, we're going to see the phrase here in verse 7, and we're going to see the phrase again in verse 11. We'll talk about verse 11 when we get there. But let's understand this verse 7, the context. Again, the context is going to determine what the breaking bread first be. Verse 7, we were gathered together to break bread. What's that talking about? It's the Lord's Supper. It's the Lord's Supper. It talks about Paul preaching to them there. He prolonged his speech to midnight. The context of when they were gathered together. We know 1 Corinthians was you partaken when they were gathered together. So Acts 20 in verse 7, what's he talking about? He's talking about the Lord's Supper. So that's what the breaking of bread is referring to. Number 3 thing we learn in this text that's important. This is the only passage that tells us the day of observance of the Lord's Supper. Acts 2:42 tells me they broke bread. Doesn't tell me when. It doesn't tell me the day they did it. 1 Corinthians says they need to partake. Jesus, when he instituted, talked about partake. 1 Corinthians verse 26, as often as you partake of it. Right? So it shows regularity, but it doesn't tell me when. Acts 20 in verse 7 is the only passage that shows me what day we need to partake. Not only is it the only passage that shows us the only day that we partake, it also shows us the regularity with which we are to partake. Number 4. This passage infers that the Lord's Supper is to be observed every first day of the week. So we talked about in Acts 15, we talked about in sermons before, Bible authority. We established it one of 3 ways. A command or statement, an approved example, or a necessary inference. We use 2 of those with the Lord's Supper from Acts 20 verse 7. The other being the command to partake. We already have that command recorded for us. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and then recorded in 1 Corinthians 11. Acts 20 verse 7, we use an approved example to know when to partake. I know it's approved because God performed a miracle through Paul later on. If it wasn't approved what they did, God wouldn't work a miracle through Paul later on. And then, I know how often, because I know they partake on the first day. We know that Christians regularly met on the first day. In fact, 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2 said that they were to give every first day, some translations would point out. Or on the first day, but every first day, some of them point out. I think not only besides 1 Corinthians 16 shows the fact that they came together every first day, but I think a parallel in the Old Testament helps us understand. Exodus chapter 20 and verse 8. Remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. How often were the Jews to remember the Sabbath day? Every time the 7th day of the week rolled around, they would remember the Sabbath day. As often as there was that day, they were to remember it. Well, we're to partake of the Lord's Supper on the first day of the week, because that's when they partook. It's the old example we have. And we partake of it every first day, because every week has the first day, and so we partake every first day. And then again, 1 Corinthians 11:26 will point out the fact that as often as you partake of it, would show the regularity in partaking of when to partake of the Lord's Supper. Number 5 now. Here's an interesting one. Number 5, this is an interesting one to know. Question gets raised sometime. Are we on Jewish time or Roman time when we talk about the first day of the week? So, let's just lay out a little bit the difference. Jewish time went from sunset to sunset. So, approximately 6 p.m. to 6 p.m. So, when they count a day, their days ended when they had to stop working for the Jews. That's how they counted it. So, when the sun set, that was the end of the day. Then the next day, or then that day started with as soon as the sun set, and that day ended at the next sunset. Romans counted days like we count days. It begins at midnight, it ends at midnight. So the question is this the Jewish or the Roman day? Here's why it's the Roman day. A few things to point out. Some say it's the Jewish time, real quick, which would actually mean they were partaking not on Sunday, but on Saturday. Because Paul prolonged his speech until midnight. So whenever they're partaking is later in the day. If it's Jewish time, they are not partaking on Sunday. They were actually partaking on what we would refer to as Saturday night. Because their days started on, they counted days from sunset to sunset. So, That's the reason this is important. Roman time is being used here by Luke. Here's some evidence of that. Troas is a Gentile nation under the Roman influence. So how would they have counted time? Midnight to midnight. Not only that, verse 11. When you get to verse 11, when Paul had gone up and broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. If they are on Jewish time, he wasn't departing the next day. He was at daybreak. He was actually departing on the same day when the sun came up. If it was Jewish time, he would have departed the next day. He would have departed the same day. Verse 7 also pointed out his intent was to depart the next day. So, just some things to note there when it comes to verse 7 and the observance of the Lord's Supper. We need to understand the significance of the first day of the week in Scriptures. We need to understand the fact that breaking of bread can refer to two different things, and the context of terms, and the context of verse 7 clearly indicates this is the Lord's Supper. Number 3, this is the only passage that shows us when to observe. So we have an approved example because of a miracle being performed later on. So we know that we have to partake on the first day of the week, the first day of the week only. We don't partake every first day because we must necessarily infer we partake on the first day, and every week has a first day. We partake every first day of the week. And then it was Sunday, not Saturday, because they were dealing with Roman time, not Jewish time. Now, after that, the observance of the Lord's Supper, we have Paul preaching and prolonging his speech until midnight in verse 7. Then, as he was still speaking, Eutychus fell asleep and fell out of the window. And he was sitting on the window, verse 9. And he's taken to a deep sleep. Paul still talked still longer, and Eutychus overcame with sleep. He fell from the third story and was taken dead. But Paul went and bent over him and taking his arm said, "Do not be alarmed, for his life is in him." And when Paul had gone up and had broken bread, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak and so departed. So Eutychus falls out of the window, and Paul goes over. Bends over and takes it up in his arm and says, "Don't be alarmed, his life is in him." Now, this is significant. Aside from the fact that the miracle was performed, it shows clearly Paul that God is with Paul. I think this is significant for another reason. I've been bringing this up already. Is because it shows me that what takes place in verse 7 is approved. It shows me what takes place in verse 7 is approved. You remember in Acts 15. In Acts chapter 15, when Paul and Barnabas gave their speech, their argument as to why the Gentiles were accepted by God is because God worked miracles through them among the Gentiles. If God hadn't approved of the work they were doing or approved of working among the Gentiles, He wouldn't have worked miracles through them among the Gentiles. How do I know that He approves of them partaking on the first day of the week? Because not only do they partake, Paul then goes out there, bends over Eutychus, and they raise him up. If God hadn't approved, He would have been raised up. But it shows me that God approved of whatever took place in this text here, yes.
I think with the Gentiles, that's a perfect example of all the gifts given after the people. It just shows you they already got the gifts for preaching and speaking and talking and approved to the Gentiles that God had approved of them, and that's still happening. So that's the only time it's done.
You know, and you're right, about the miracle. Not only though for those who are Christians here, there could have been some, I guess there were some still up toward midnight in the city going around that would have seen the miracle take place, or at least would have heard of it shortly thereafter, and it may have had a great impact even after Paul left those left behind on those of the city. Come to verse 11. When Paul had gone up and broken bread and eaten, he conversed with them a long while until daybreak, and so departed. I'll read the paragraph here. Eutychus fell out of the window, 8 through 12. The meeting took place in the upper room, or third story at evening. And Eutychus was sitting in a window and fell into a deep sleep, fell to the ground and killed him, for he was taken to dead. Verse 9. Paul raised him from the dead, verse 10 and 12. This showed God's approval of the meeting and Paul's preaching, which we already pointed out. After that, Paul laid and visited with the brethren until daylight and then departed. So verse 11. Here's just running through. Paul had gone up, broke bread, and move on. There are sometimes verse 11 is a verse that is used to argue for. Anybody know what verse 11 is sometimes used to argue for?
Church meals, is that what you?
Sometimes people argue for verse 11 for church meals. It's become a less and less common argument, I think. I think more often people will argue from phrases like the love feast and other things. But it was an argument that people had used for quite a while concerning, well, the church can have social meals for everybody. There's one thing about verse 11 I think is important to note that answers that question right then and there. In verse 11, who ate? In verse 11, who was the one eating? It's just Paul. So, Paul had eaten something. They brought something for him. I don't know what all, but it's not the church having a meal for everybody to eat here. This is Paul eating a meal and being nourished and replenished before setting out on this journey. It's not a church-sponsored social meal where everybody came together. There's only one person eating in verse 11. And the only person eating is the Apostle Paul. And so it's not a church-sponsored social meal taking place in verse 11. Again, that's not a passage used, I don't think, as much anymore. I've heard of some people say they talk to some Bishop brother who use that occasionally, but it's not one used, I don't think, as much anymore because that one was answered, I think, more easily than some of the love feasts, which is a more confusing text. And so it's not used as much, but we just need to be familiar with that. So when somebody asks us a question, we'll see here that we're eating in verse 11. It's just Paul that's eating in verse 11. Paul went, he had broken bread and eaten. So it was just a meal for one person. I don't know what somebody brought for him or what. But Paul was given a meal, and he's the only one that ate, and it was to nourish him before he left, and it's not the same thing as a church-sponsored social meal.
Well, what we don't know is they said, "Have you eaten, Paul?" And he said, "No." And they went and got him something to eat and brought it to him.
Right, we don't know all that information.
We didn't need to know that.
No, you're right, we don't. I think it's just significant to understand. I've heard a couple arguments. I've heard some argue it's a church-sponsored social meal. I've heard some argue it's just the Lord's Supper. It can't be the Lord's Supper.
No.
Because, first of all, they already took of it. It can't be more detailed because when verse 11 takes place, it's already after midnight.
And they did that already.
Right, they'd already done it, and we're after midnight. So even if we're giving more detail, I don't think it fit. Either one of those fit the context. It's just Paul having a meal that was given to him before he set sail the next day to replenish him. Because Paul continues after that meal, speaking with them until he leaves. And I think that's something to understand. 13 through 16, we'll hit this rather quickly. And then we'll pick up in verse 17 next time. But going on ahead, verse 13, to the ship. We set sail for Assos, intending to take Paul aboard there, for so he had arranged, intending himself to go by land. And when they met at Assos, he took him aboard and went to Middlebourne. And sailing from there, he came down to Chios. The next day, we touched at Samos. And the day after that, he went to Miletus, for Paul had decided to set sail past Ephesus, so that he might not spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem, if possible, on the day of Pentecost. So, 13 through 16 here, he leaves verse 13, he sets sail, he comes on down, they arrange for Paul to go by land, so he met them down at Assos, and he aboard the ship there. He was on down to Middlebourne, or Middlebourne, and goes there. From there they go to Chios. From there they go to Samos. Samos he comes to Miletus. He went past Asia, or Ephesus, so that he might not spend time in Asia, for he was hastening to be at Jerusalem. So again, if you look at the map, you see Paul sort of make this U-turn, but he misses the area of Asia again, where he spent a great deal of time already. He doesn't go back through Ephesus and Asia. He's trying to make it to Jerusalem before the day of Pentecost. Now, Paul doesn't have time to go through Asia if he's going to make it to Jerusalem by Pentecost, because Paul had a good relationship with the brethren there, or he spent a great deal of time there. They might have been trying to encourage him to stay like they had the previous time. And so Paul doesn't go through there. But he doesn't leave them without warning. And that's what we'll see the next time, where he comes and he warns and talks to the Ephesian elders. So he doesn't have time to go through and talk to everybody, but he does have time to warn the Ephesian elders of some things and some upcoming apostasy that's going to take place in the last half of this chapter. So that's where we'll pick up on verse 17 and talk about the address to the Ephesian elders. And on Sunday, go ahead. Don't know if we'll get there. Go ahead and prepare for the next chapter as well, just in case we finish and get into the next chapter as well.